In 1946, inside an American intelligence office, a German file lies open under a desk lamp. On the cover is the name of a man who worked for the Third Reich. Inside are party forms, military records, technical reports, and lines too dangerous to show an immigration officer. An officer reads the file, makes a note, and reaches for a clean sheet of paper. In the old version of the biography, the man is a Nazi specialist tied to Hitler's war machine. In the new version, he becomes an apolitical scientist, a technical expert, a man of exceptional value to national security. Between those two versions of the past sits one small metal paperclip. That is how one of the most uncomfortable bargains of the 20th century began. The United States secretly brought in and employed more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and doctors. Some had built rockets for Hitler. Some had worked inside military factories. Some had worn Nazi uniforms, used forced labor, or developed technology inside a criminal state. 24 years later, a rocket built under the direction of one of those men would carry Americans toward the moon. The world would see the triumph, but it would not see the file. This is not a story about science being evil. And it is not a story claiming that space exploration was built only by criminals. It is more complicated than that. It is a story about victors bargaining with their own morality before the war had even fully ended. It is about men who could have been investigated yesterday becoming employees of American laboratories tomorrow. It is about an underground factory in Germany leading step by step to a launch pad in Florida. And it is about why sometimes the most frightening sound in history is not the roar of a rocket. It is the quiet click of a paperclip closing on a file. April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing, and across the ruins of Europe, a second race begins, quieter than artillery and longer than the war itself. From the west come American, British, and French forces. From the east comes the Red Army. Between them are burned cities, broken roads, abandoned vehicles, and German offices still trying to destroy their papers. For an ordinary soldier, the objective is simple: reach Berlin, survive, and end the war. But behind the front lines move other teams, carrying different lists and different orders. They are not looking for bridges or crossroads. They're looking for laboratories, factory safes, university archives, professors' offices, warehouses full of drawings, and employee card files. They are not searching for territory. They are searching for people: physicists, rocket engineers, chemists, doctors, jet engine specialists, radar experts, and men who had spent 12 years serving one of the most aggressive military machines in history. American intelligence already has a guide: captured lists of German specialists assembled during the final years of the Reich. One of them, the Osenberg list, becomes a map of the scientific nerve system of Nazi Germany. For Nazi Germany, it had been a list of last hopes. For the victors, it becomes a treasure map. Who worked on rockets? Who understood fuel? Who designed gyroscopes? Who knew how a missile could climb above any aircraft and fall on a city without warning? American officers understand the danger at once. If these men fall into Soviet hands, the next race may begin with a catastrophic American delay. On April 11th, 1945, American troops enter the area around Nordhausen in Thuringia. From the outside, it looks like another exhausted German town, surrounded by hills, rail lines, and the wreckage of war. But near the town is a mountain, and inside that mountain is a factory. The soldiers go down into the tunnels, then deeper still. What opens before them is not a workshop and not a warehouse, but an underground industrial city. There are long parallel tunnels, side galleries, rails, cranes, cables, assembly lines, electrical panels, ventilation pipes, rocket casings, tools, and crates of components disappearing into the dark. This is Mittelwerk, the most secret production site of the Third Reich. Here, under the mountain, Germany assembled the V-2. The V-2 was the first operational ballistic missile in history. It rose above 80 kilometers, moved faster than sound, and struck before people on the ground could hear it coming. Technologically, it was a miracle. Humanly, it was a crime scene. Next to the factory was Dora-Mittelbau, Tens of thousands of prisoners passed through that system, and about 20,000 did not survive. In the story the victors were supposed to tell, this place would become evidence of Nazi crimes, and it did. But at that same moment, beside the tunnels and the camp, there were rockets, drawings, pumps, turbines, gyroscopes, fuel systems, and trajectory calculations. Everything that had to be taken before Soviet troops arrived. That decision only makes sense if you remember the map of Europe in the spring of 1945. The Americans knew they would not remain everywhere their tanks had reached. The borders of the occupation zones had already been agreed. Today, a city might be under American control. Tomorrow, it would be handed to the Soviet administration. So, in some places, the front began to look less like a normal military operation and more like a robbery against a ticking clock. Only the prize was not gold. It was the future. Intelligence teams entered laboratories still smelling of chemicals. They opened safes, removed maps from walls, packed microfilms, and carried away files filled with names. In war, people often say that whoever takes the city first wins. In 1945, a new rule appeared. Whoever takes the archive first wins the next war. Colonel Holger Tolstoy understood the clock. Thuringia would soon pass into the Soviet occupation zone. And if the Soviets found the full factory, full warehouses, and full documentation, the rocket race would begin differently. Tolstoy requested hundreds of railroad cars. Crates went onto platforms, rocket bodies went onto trains, engine parts went to ports, and tons of documents moved toward the Atlantic. Soldiers who had crossed Europe to end a war were now shipping the components of the next era out of Germany. But Tolstoy understood the essential point. Metal without people is only metal. A rocket can be dismantled. The knowledge of how to improve it lives inside the engineer. In early May 1945, in Bavaria, the Americans receive a prisoner who does not behave like a broken man. He is 33 years old. His arm is in a plaster cast after a car accident. He is aristocratic, calm, confident, and already aware of his own price. His name is Werner von Braun. Formally, he is a German rocket engineer who worked for Hitler. In reality, he is one of the few people on Earth who has already built an operational ballistic missile. But von Braun has not arrived alone. He has a team, and that matters. A single genius impresses journalists, but a rocket is built by a system. Engine designers, fuel pump specialists, ballistics experts, materials engineers, and men who know why a valve freezes or why a gyroscope begins to drift. Von Braun knows that his value is greatest, not as a lone prisoner, but as the leader of a group. The German rocket men must not be scattered into camps or divided between armies. In one famous scene, his brother Magnus approaches an American soldier on a bicycle and says that his brother invented the V2 and wants to surrender. Sometimes, history really does look too cinematic. But behind that cinematic image is cold calculation. Von Braun is not surrendering like an ordinary prisoner of war. He is offering a package: himself, his team, his papers, his knowledge, and the future. Germany has lost. But formulas have not lost. Blueprints have not surrendered. Engines have no nationality. Later, von Braun will say that he always dreamed of space. That is true. As a boy, his mother gave him a telescope. As a teenager, he read Hermann Oberth and dreamed of other planets. At 15, he strapped fireworks to a small wagon and sent it racing through a Berlin street. But the dream of space does not explain everything. In 1932, the army came to him with money, laboratories, test stands, protection, and one condition: rockets for war. Von Braun accepted. Later, he joined the Nazi Party, and later still, he became an SS officer. His defenders would say it was a formality, a way to protect his work under pressure. His critics would answer that a formality still leaves a signature, especially when the signature is on the papers of a state-building war in camps. Von Braun was not a simple villain from a poster. That is what makes him more dangerous as a historical figure. He was brilliant, charming, and able to inspire people. He could speak about the moon as if it were already waiting behind the next door. But, again and again, he chose a path where his dream could coexist with the suffering of others. Peenemünde. the V2, Mittelwerk, Dora. He visited the underground factory. That is documented. He discussed technical production questions. He knew that these rockets were not being assembled in an ordinary civilian plant. Perhaps he did not know the full scale of the deaths. Perhaps he knew more than he later admitted. But some things do not require knowing every number. If you visit an underground military factory, you see the guards. You see who stands at the machines. You see that this is not a normal factory. And still, the work continued. The rocket program moved forward inside the same darkness. If we call von Braun simply a monster, the story becomes convenient. Monsters can be pushed away into someone else's past, someone else's uniform, someone else's ideology. But von Braun is frightening because he looks less like a monster than a gifted careerist with a magnificent dream. He does not say, "I want evil." He says, "I want the moon." He does not say that people do not matter. He says his work is above politics. He does not say he serves a criminal system. He says there is no other way to build the rocket. Those sentences sound dangerously familiar. They are not shouted. They are spoken calmly by intelligent people in dark times. Von Braun's first interrogation looks strange. American officers expect a captured specialist, but before them is a man calmly explaining ballistics, drawing diagrams, and describing engines, fuel, guidance, altitude, range, and the future. It is no longer quite an interrogation. It is a job interview. Von Braun demonstrates not only knowledge, but usefulness. He is saying, in effect, you can lock me away, or you can build with me what you do not yet have. Reports go to Washington, calling the captured Peenemünde personnel among the most valuable technical resources taken in Europe. That sentence will outweigh many moral objections. The first name for the program is Operation Overcast. It sounds almost harmless. Bring German specialists temporarily, use their knowledge, and keep them under military control. But the word temporary becomes a sedative. Temporarily bring them in. Temporarily house them. Temporarily use them. Temporarily avoid the hardest questions. Temporary decisions, inside a state, often live longer than principles. First, the specialists arrive as military trophies, then as consultants, then employees, then immigrants, then citizens. Each next step seems logical if you forget the one before it. If he is already working, why send him back? If he works well, why interfere? If he is needed for national security, why alarm the press? If 10 years have passed, why reopen the past? In this way, a scandalous decision stops looking scandalous. It simply becomes part of the system. The legal problem remains. President Truman has ordered that no active Nazis and no war criminals be admitted into the United States. On paper, the principle is clear. An immigrant must submit forms, pass a background check, and be approved. A man with a serious Nazi record should be rejected. But the army and intelligence services see another danger: the Soviet Union. If these specialists do not work for America, they may work for Moscow. So a parallel road is built. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency receives German personnel files, studies them, and prepares new versions. Dangerous lines disappear. Party activity becomes a formality. Service to a military program becomes technical work. Political responsibility becomes apolitical expertise. In the old file, the man is part of a war machine. In the new one, he is useful to national security. In 1947, the FBI sends JIOA a memorandum with 28 names. The Bureau considers these men active Nazis or potential war criminals. The answer is cold. They are indispensable. The investigation is stopped, and the memorandum is classified inside the American government. Not everyone agrees with this logic. The State Department fears a political bomb. Lawyers see legal danger. And the FBI gathers material that cannot honestly be called clean. But the Army and intelligence services have an argument that closes almost every discussion in 1946. If we do not take them, the Soviets will. That sentence turns a moral question into a military one. And military questions at the beginning of the Cold War are answered quickly, quietly, and with fewer witnesses. The name Paperclip becomes a symbol. According to one version, paperclips marked the files of specialists who needed to be moved through the system more quietly or more quickly. A small piece of metal on the corner of a folder began to decide what no paperclip should decide: who remained a criminal of the past and who became an engineer of the future. Fort Bliss, Texas. White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. In the American desert, German engineers assemble the V2 again. The same shapes, the same principles, many of the same men at the drawings. Only now, a different flag stands nearby. To people in the region, it looks strange. Former specialists of the Reich working among American trucks, tents, officers, and desert wind. They check pumps, fuel lines, gyroscopes, guidance systems, and valves. American engineers watch and learn. The first launches are not clean steps toward the space age. Rockets fail, fall, veer off course, explode, and force everyone to learn in the hardest possible way. They have to understand liquid fuel, vibration, stabilization, altitude measurement, telemetry, and a machine built inside a different industrial culture. The Germans sometimes irritate the Americans with their arrogance. The Americans irritate the Germans with bureaucracy and inexperience. Between them are language, distrust, and the memory of war. The rocket becomes the translator. It forces former enemies to stand over the same drawing and solve the same problem. Why does this thing not fly the way it should? At first, their American life is not a triumph. Fort Bliss is not a glamorous university campus. The German specialists live under army supervision. Their movements are limited, their mail can be checked, and their status is ambiguous. Not quite prisoners, not quite freemen, not quite employees. Some joke bitterly that they are prisoners of peace or prisoners of our victory. Germany has lost, but their knowledge is too valuable to let them vanish into ordinary civilian life. Von Braun quickly understands that America loves not only technology, America loves stories. And he begins to tell the right story. Not Peenemünde, not Dora, not party membership. The moon, Mars, the future of humanity. Rockets that will one day carry people, not explosives. Journalists discover a tall German professor who speaks about the stars with a nearly religious brightness in his eyes. He is far more interesting than ordinary army officials. Then come articles, magazines, and Walt Disney television films in which von Braun explains space travel to millions of American families. On screen, he is not a former SS officer, not a weapons engineer, not a man from the dark corners of Germany's past. He is the professor of tomorrow. Television rewrites his emotional biography. Now he belongs not to Germany's past, but to America's future. But behind the public face are other names. Arthur Rudolph, one of the key engineers of Mittelwerk, will later become essential to the Saturn V program. In 1984, the Department of Justice will confront him over his wartime past. Rudolph will give up his American citizenship and return to Germany rather than face a courtroom. Hubertus Strughold will be called the father of space medicine in America. His work will help shape medical preparation for astronauts. Later, his name will be removed from a library after disputes and declassified material connect him to the system of Nazi medical research. This is one of the darkest layers of the story, because medicine is supposed to protect the human being. Yet some knowledge about survival in extreme conditions came from a world where the human being was treated as an object. In a peaceful space program, those questions sounded noble, but the source of some data remained dark. At the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, American prosecutors argued that medicine which turns prisoners into experimental material is a crime. In other offices, officials asked which German specialists and data might be useful for aviation and space. Again, it came down to language. Experiment on prisoners sounds like a crime. Data on high-altitude physiology sounds like a resource. The Soviet Union did not look at America's hunt for German specialists as a moral scandal. It looked at it as a threat. If the Americans had taken von Braun, Moscow needed its own German engineers. If the United States had removed equipment from Thuringia, The Soviet Union would remove the knowledge still left behind. On October 22nd, 1946, at about 3 in the morning, doors across the Soviet occupation zone were knocked on at the same time. Operation Paperclip had begun. Soviet officers arrived at the homes of German specialists using prepared address lists. Some were persuaded. Some were simply informed. Men packed papers, women gathered children's clothing, and children did not understand why they were being woken in the night. Trains moved east, carrying engineers, families, drawings, instruments, fear, and uncertainty. The scale was enormous. More than 2,000 German specialists and several thousand people with their families were sent into the Soviet Union. This was not the American model of contracts, new homes, and gradual legalization. It was the forced evacuation of knowledge. One of the most important German rocket specialists on the Soviet side was Helmut Grottrup, a former Peenemünde engineer. He worked near Soviet designers, but he never became the Soviet version of von Braun. The Soviet system learned differently. German specialists advised, explained, and transferred knowledge, but key decisions gradually moved into Soviet hands. Among the Soviet engineers was Sergei Korolev. His name would remain a state secret for years. Korolev had survived the Gulag. He had been nearly destroyed by the system that now needed him to build rockets for it. Korolev is the mirror character of this story. Von Braun comes to the Americans as a man who successfully bargains with the victors. Korolev returns to history as a man whose own country first broke him, then pulled him back from the prison system because he was useful. One sells the dream of space through magazines and television. The other remains the chief designer without a public name. One becomes the face of America's future. The other becomes the secret of Soviet success. German specialists in the Soviet Union were placed in closed facilities, research towns, and technical centers. One symbolic place was Gorodomlya on Lake Seliger, where German rocket engineers lived in a separate world. There were families, schools, workshops, drafting tables, translated documents, and efforts to reproduce and improve the V-2. The Soviet R-1 rocket owed much to the German A-4, but Moscow did not intend to depend on German engineers forever. Their knowledge had to be extracted, organized, transferred to Soviet collectives, and then the original carriers of that knowledge could be moved aside. The United States integrated some German specialists and made a few of them public figures. The Soviet Union used them as a closed resource, and later returned many to East Germany. 2 different states, 2 different systems, the same fear. Do not let the future enemy take the advantage. On October 4th, 1957, a Soviet R-7 rocket placed a small aluminum sphere into orbit. It was 58 centimeters wide, with 4 antennas, and its name was Sputnik 1. The signal was almost absurdly simple. Beep, beep, beep. But in Washington, it sounded like an alarm. The signal was not really about the satellite. It was about the rocket beneath it. If a rocket could place a sphere in orbit, it could also carry a warhead across an ocean. American radio amateurs heard the signal in their headphones. Parents brought children into backyards and pointed at the night sky. Newspapers wrote about a Soviet technological leap. Politicians spoke of failures in education, science, intelligence, and defense. For the first time in years, America felt that the future might not belong to America. Sputnik struck more than the military. It struck the country's sense of itself. Americans were used to imagining themselves as the technological peak of the free world. Now, a Soviet object passed above their homes every 90 minutes. Schools began talking differently about mathematics. Universities talked differently about physics. Congress talked differently about funding science. One small sphere changed school schedules, military budgets, political speeches, and the status of engineers. Suddenly, men like von Braun were needed not only by the army, but by national self-respect. The United States had its own official satellite project, Vanguard. In December 1957, its rocket lifted from Cape Canaveral live in front of cameras. It rose only briefly, lost thrust, fell back, and vanished in a cloud of fire. The small satellite was thrown aside and kept sending a weak signal from beside the wreckage. Newspapers called it Flopnik, Staputnik, and Kaputnik. For Soviet propaganda, it was a gift. For American society, it was humiliation. After that, Washington stopped debating whether von Braun's team should be trusted with the launch. The question changed. How fast can he do it? Before Sputnik, von Braun was not the obvious public savior. Inside the American system, the Navy's Vanguard project looked cleaner, more civilian, and politically easier. The Army team around von Braun looked more complicated. Too military, too German, too connected to the past. But crisis changes aesthetics. America needed a result. On January 31st, 1958, a Jupiter C rocket placed Explorer 1 into orbit. The first American satellite had finally reached space. Von Braun stood before reporters holding a model rocket above his head, smiling widely. The photograph went everywhere. Under the photograph was his name. Not Peenemünde, not Mittelwerk, not Dora. The former engineer of Hitler's rocket program had become one of the symbols of America's answer to Moscow. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announces that America will land a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade is over. For von Braun, this is not just a government assignment. It is the dream of his life. Saturn V becomes an industrial empire, a rocket more than 100 meters tall, weighing about 3,000 tons, with 5 giant first-stage engines. Thousands of contractors, factories across the country, test stands, computing centers, transport barges, and assembly buildings the size of cathedrals are drawn into the effort. Every valve, every wire, every seam must work. A failure does not mean only a failed mission. It could mean the death of a crew in front of the world. Von Braun is ideal for this system. He can speak to engineers in the language of drawings, to politicians in the language of national dreams, and to journalists in the language of the future. He is not only a designer, he is a salesman of space. On July 16th, 1969, Saturn V rises from Cape Kennedy. The fire beneath it is so bright, it seems as if the Earth itself has opened. Millions watch the broadcast. People stand on Florida beaches with binoculars. Families around the world freeze in front of television sets. It is one of the greatest moments in human history, and it really is great. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong steps onto the surface of the moon. Von Braun applauds. America weeps with joy. But almost no one says in that moment that the road to the moon passed not only through Huntsville, Washington, and Cape Kennedy. It also passed through Peenemünde, through Mittelwerk, through files that were rewritten, through the paperclip. This is why the story gives no easy answer. The moon was not a lie. It was real. American engineers did not merely borrow everything. They built an enormous, complex, heroic system. But you cannot cut the beginning of the chain out of the film because it is uncomfortable. A rocket can fly to the moon and still carry the shadow of a tunnel under Nordhausen. It is easy here to say that the end does not justify the means. But history is not that convenient. Without these decisions, the space race might have looked different. Perhaps the American program would have moved more slowly. Perhaps the Soviet advantage would have lasted longer. History does not allow us to remove von Braun and run the experiment again. It gives us only the reality that happened. And in that reality, triumph and compromise were bolted together inside the same rocket. Throughout the Cold War, Operation Paperclip remained officially classified. The public knew that German scientists worked in American laboratories, but not the full scale of the program. The rewritten files, the methods, and many specific names stayed inside closed archives. In the 1970s, the first official confirmations appeared. Then journalists and historians began pulling documents from agencies, commissions, and archives. The more files opened, the clearer the pattern became. First, use them temporarily. Then extend the contract. Then arrange immigration. Then grant citizenship. Then place the man inside a university, a laboratory, a military center, or NASA. The past did not vanish. It became a biographical detail, not mentioned at ceremonies. Archives have a strange quality. They are patient. Politicians leave. Generals leave. Scientists leave. Newspaper headlines turn yellow. But the file remains, the signature remains, the date remains, the note in the margin remains. One day, a person who was not there in 1946 opens a box and sees what the participants wanted to keep inside the system. History returns not as a loud explosion, but as the rustle of paper. And that rustle rarely comes in time. When journalists and historians began assembling the full picture, many documents were scattered across agencies, and some remained closed. The participants were dead or too old to answer for decisions made decades earlier. Secrecy changes not only the present, it steals from the future the chance to judge the past in time. If society learns the truth, 50 years later, it can write a book, make a film, change a plaque, or open a museum display. But it cannot hold the conversation that should have happened in 1946. By the time much of the story emerged, many of the central men were gone. Wernher von Braun died in 1977, praised as a man who helped America reach the moon. Arthur Rudolph died in Germany in 1996 after giving up his American citizenship. Hubertus Strughold died in 1986, while arguments over his name continued after his death. Justice arrived decades too late. It could change labels, not lives. Today, this story can be seen in two places. At Dora-Mittelbau, there is a memorial, tunnels, stone, plaques, and empty space where words feel too loud. There is no triumph there. There is the memory of people for whom the rocket was not a dream of space, but a shift, a tunnel, a command, and a system that saw the human body as a tool. In Huntsville, Alabama, there is the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. There lies a Saturn V, enormous and beautiful, a machine almost impossible to look at without awe. Children stand beneath its engines with open mouths. Adults photograph the hardware. Guides speak of the moon, NASA, and the great leap of humanity. Both places are true. Both are about rockets. Both are about labor, but about different kinds of labor. If you put Dora and Huntsville side by side, you get the map of Operation Paperclip, Saturn V in the light and the tunnel in the dark. Operation Paperclip was not unique. That makes it more frightening, not less. States have used people with uncomfortable pasts whenever their knowledge seems strategically important. The Soviet Union did it. Britain did it. The United States did it. The argument is always similar. We cannot afford moral luxury right now. We have to win. We have to get the technology before the enemy does. We will ask the questions later, but later almost always comes too late. Witnesses disappear. Documents vanish. Participants receive pensions. Heroes become monuments. Files gather dust in archives. Only decades later does society begin to ask what was hidden inside the victory. This is why the story still matters. It is not only about 1945, and it is not only about German rocket scientists. It is about a mechanism that can wake up in any age when fear of an enemy becomes stronger than a country's own rules. In 1946, that mechanism looked like a file, a paperclip, and a bureaucrat's signature. In another time, it may look different. But the question is the same. Who decides that a person's past can be cleaned because their future usefulness is too valuable? In 2004, the United States Congress acknowledged that some participants in Operation Paperclip had been war criminals or active Nazis. In 2006, Hubertus Strughold's name was removed from a library in Texas. In 2014, Annie Jacobson's book returned Operation Paperclip to public debate. But most people still know the ending better than the beginning. They know Apollo 11. They know Neil Armstrong. They know Saturn V. They do not know which files lay on desks in 1946. They do not know why some biographies became cleaner than they had been. They do not know that sometimes the road to the stars does not begin on a launch pad. It begins in an office, where a man closes a folder, puts a paperclip on it, and decides which past may be left out of the frame. History does not have to be comfortable. It has to be truthful. That is its work.